Hello and welcome to The View from Washington, a new mini-series with The Hindu. I'm Sriram Lakshman, your host. And in the run-up to the general elections in the US on November 5th, I will be bringing you weekly analysis from Washington, D.C. on the race between Democratic candidate and Vice President Kamala Harris and her Republican opponent, former President Donald Trump. We'll also be looking at some of the down-ballot races, such as for the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. In addition to this, we'll analyze major foreign policy news every week coming out of Washington, D.C., especially if it relates to India. With just over 3 weeks to go to Election Day, Kamala Harris has been engaged in an unusual media blitz, using a range of interviews strategically selected to appeal to different segments of voters. Ever since President Joe Biden stepped down at the end of July and Kamala Harris was made the presumptive and then official Democratic candidate, Harris has not held a formal press conference. As the vice president, she's also a little bit of an unknown quantity relative to her opponent Donald Trump, who as former president has already been in the Oval Office, and although he may be a polarizing figure, he is a known quantity. Harris's interviews of the last few days included a conversation with an all-woman panel on ABC's The View. She spoke to Howard Stern, whose audience comprises a large number of married white males. She was on 60 Minutes, as well as on the Call Her Daddy podcast with millennial host Alexandra Cooper. During these interviews, she was asked a range of questions, some softballs and some tough ones. For instance, she was quizzed on her changing positions, for example, on fracking, where she has backed off a ban on the process. The fracking industry is important in Pennsylvania, which is perhaps the most crucial state in the path to the White House. Harris was also quizzed on why she's adopted a harder line on illegal migration. Her general response has been that she's traveled the country, spoken to people, and has modified her views in an attempt to find common ground. This, plus a discussion about her gun ownership, are ways in which she is appealing to moderate voters and Republicans who are not part of Trump's MAGA or Make America Great Again platform.
I have a Glock, and I've had it for quite some time. And look, Bill, my background is in law enforcement. And so there you go.
Have you ever fired it?
Yes. Of course I have. At a shooting range. Yes, of course I have.
Republicans in general are in favor of stronger laws protecting gun ownership, and Harris's comfort talking about her gun, she first mentioned it a few weeks ago in an event with Oprah Winfrey, may be to assuage concerns of Republicans that she would go too far in terms of gun control if elected president. So on ABC's The View, Harris was asked which policies of Joe Biden she would have approached differently had she been president, and she indicated that she was pretty much aligned with all his policies, except perhaps she would have had a Republican on her cabinet. She, in fact, announced that there would be a Republican in her cabinet if she's elected to the presidency.
Absolutely. Yeah. Listen, I plan on having a Republican in my cabinet.
I got a list.
Yes, right. You asked me what's the difference between Joe Biden and me. Well, that will be one of the differences. I'm going to have a Republican in my cabinet because I don't feel burdened by letting pride get in the way of a good idea.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the Republican campaign lines has been that Harris, as Biden's border czar and as his vice president, is responsible for the Biden-Harris administration's policies. This has been the Republican campaign's way of maintaining some continuity in the Democratic campaign and in their messaging against the Democratic campaign in the face of the Democratic candidate switching from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. So when Kamala Harris said she would not have done anything differently from Joe Biden, Trump highlighted this, but using sexist terminology and calling people names. One of the other strategies that both Republican and Democratic campaigns have employed in recent days has been campaigning with surrogates. This is, of course, nothing new. But this time it's interesting because Kamala Harris actually had Liz Cheney, a former Republican congresswoman, campaign with her in Ripon, Wisconsin, the birthplace of the Republican Party. Liz Cheney is the daughter of Dick Cheney, vice president during George W. Bush's administration. And Liz Cheney said she'd never voted Democrat before, but this time she would be voting for Kamala Harris. It's safe to say she is not a fan of Donald Trump.
I have never voted for a Democrat. But this year, I am proudly casting my vote for Vice President Kamala Harris.
Donald Trump, meanwhile, campaigned with Elon Musk, a billionaire entrepreneur and owner of X, formerly Twitter. This campaign event was held in Butler County, Pennsylvania, last Saturday, October 5th.
Come on up here, Elon. He created the first major American car company in generations, and his rocket company is the only reason we can now send American astronauts into space. Come here. Take over, Elon. Yes, take over.
Elon Musk had gone all out in his support for Trump. Amongst his claims is that Democrats will get rid of the freedom of expression, which is protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, if they're elected to power. He's saying this based on comments Democrats have made regarding the use of freedom of expression in the context of misinformation and hate speech. And he's also alleged that this will be the last elections if Democrats are elected to power. If Kamala Harris becomes president, Elon Musk says that the Democrats will flood swing states with illegal migrants, and those migrants will eventually become citizens and vote in such a way that they will give Democrats a long-term supermajority in those states. In fact, it was Donald Trump who suggested that if he is elected, it will be the last election. Addressing Christians at a campaign event in July, he said that in 4 years, quote, we'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote, unquote. Elon Musk has also offered $47 to any person who can get a registered swing state voter to sign an online petition supporting the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. So in terms of campaigning, on Thursday, October 10th, Donald Trump campaigned in Michigan, speaking to the Detroit Economic Club. He's focusing on the economy. The economy is the top issue for voters.
When foreign leaders and CEOs call me up to complain about our tariffs, my answer will be very simple. Build it in America. You don't have any tariffs. Build it right here in Detroit.
Kamala Harris is also campaigning in swing states towards the end of this week. Former President Barack Obama kicked off his campaign for Kamala Harris on Thursday with an event in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Kamala is as prepared for the job as any nominee for president has ever been. That's his campaign.
Progressive Senator, Independent Senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, is also campaigning for Harris in the swing state of Michigan. Also in the news has been Hurricane Helene, which has killed more than 200 people in recent days, and Hurricane Milton, which made landfall on Wednesday night. Trump and his supporters have claimed that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has run out of funding, or that the Biden administration is diverting funds from disaster relief to illegal migrants. This has faced pushback, not just from Harris and the White House, as well as the FEMA chief, but also some Republican lawmakers.
It's profound, and it is the height of irresponsibility and, frankly, callousness. Yeah. So lives are literally at stake right now. I traveled to Georgia and to North Carolina after Hurricane Helene. In Georgia, I met a woman who, just days earlier, her husband was killed in their home by a fallen tree. And the idea that somebody would be playing political games for the sake of himself, but this is so consistent about Donald Trump. He puts himself before the needs of others. I fear that he really lacks empathy on a very basic level.
So a foreign policy snippet from this week. During a podcast interview that aired a few days ago, Donald Trump talked about Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He said that Modi was the nicest human being, but he also said that he could be a total killer. He talked about Modi's reaction when India was under threat, without naming the threat. I think if Trump is elected to the White House, then we can expect many more such episodes. We saw a lot of those during his first term. And finally, a quick look at what the opinion polls are saying this week. First, let's look at the US Congress, the House, and the Senate. The House is narrowly controlled by Republicans at the moment, and indications are that Democrats are set to flip this chamber. It's a totally different story in the Senate, where currently Democrats have 51 out of 100 seats. Republicans are poised to take control of this chamber. Especially vulnerable is Senator John Tester of Montana, who is the Democratic senator, and he is behind his Republican opponent, a first-time candidate, businessman and former Navy SEAL Tim Sheehy. Also, Joe Manchin, the independent senator from West Virginia, who caucuses with Democrats, is retiring, and Republicans are waiting to snap up that West Virginia Senate seat. So what about the White House? A Reuters Ipsos poll projects an exceptionally tight race, but says Harris is ahead. The poll says Harris is leading Trump amongst suburban voters, 47% to 41%. Trump was leading this segment by 3 percentage points as long as Joe Biden was in the race. And Trump actually lost the segment in 2020. And again, he's trailing now that Harris is in the race. Harris is also gaining support from middle-income households, now leading Trump 45% to 43%. So these are households that make between $50,000 and $100,000 a year. Harris is leading by 2 percentage points, but it's worth noting that the margin of error around these figures is 3 percentage points. In a poll conducted October 4th to 7th, Harris led Trump nationally 46% to 43%. This is not too different from the 2.5 percentage point lead Harris has over Trump, according to an average of polls by pollster 538.com. As always, please do not forget to read the health warning on poll predictions. Polls underestimated the support for Donald Trump in 2016. Even otherwise, the winner of these polls, the winner of the popular vote, does not necessarily win the US election. Hillary Clinton in 2016 won the popular vote but did not win the election. Why? Because of the electoral college system in the US. If you win the popular vote in a given state, then rather than getting a proportion of the electoral college seats allocated to that state, proportional to the votes you won in that state, you actually get the entire batch of electoral college seats allocated to that state. So whoever gets 270 electoral college seats out of 538 seats wins the presidency. Also, don't forget, there are more than 3 weeks before the US goes to the polls, and that's a long, long time in politics. Still enough time, perhaps, for an October surprise. That's it from me for now. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.